green burial from concept to reality. Just briefly, if you're not too familiar with who we are Canada's leading cemetery planning, design, management firm. This company came to birth in 1998 after I was 20 years in the public sector in parks and cemeteries. And the group of people you see here are all passionate about creating meaningful places of memory. That's why we work together and why we've gathered. And Rebecca's introduced herself, but I should also mention Lacey Barr and Patrick Beach, who have been central to the research and production of this webinar. In fact, the previous webinar as well. This is the second in a series. We have at least one more. In fact, we've got many more planned, but the next one will be on cemetery master planning. So we look forward to your input on that as well. And we did record the first one on cemetery trends, so that's available if you or others in your organization would like to see it. What we're going to do today is really trace the evolution of green burial, and we're going to be moving from the historic to the current, from the general to the specific, looking at current practices, really laying out what the green burial philosophy is. It's an emerging philosophy, why you might consider green burial, and as Rebecca said, there will be a short question period in the middle, and then we'll talk more specifically about incorporating green burial into your cemetery, and a little bit on the close, along with some additional resources, some of the thoughts we have on the future of green burial and disposition options in particular. Green burial is really a story of what is old is new again. Historically, burials occurred in churchyards adjacent to a place of worship. And then as populations grew, and certainly as cities grew, cemeteries were located more on rural lands and away from the core of the city. Many may not know this, but the beginning of the modern day parks movement really began in cemeteries. The idea that open spaces are places of respite and contemplation, and that we need these in order to balance the effects of urban life. The latter half of the 40s, 50s, 60s, the 1900s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, lawn cemeteries came into being, and this was really the beginning of the industrialization, if I might say, certainly the commercialization of cemeteries, the ability to cut massive acreages with modernized equipment, the advent of fossil fuel driven equipment, the ability to produce monuments and bring them from afar. All of these things combined with a desire to minimize maintenance led to the lawn cemetery. And of course, most recently, especially in the last 30 or 40 years, the advent of cremation, columbarium, and above ground interment options for cremated remains have become much more part of the fabric of cemeteries. But green burial is really, in many ways, the old traditional country burial. It is also pretty much exemplified by the way that those of the Jewish faith, the Muslim faith, First Nations, and Native Americans have buried and continue to bury their dead. So without going into a whole lot more detail on the history of cemeteries, which is probably a whole other webinar in itself, we're really seeing, we're closing the loop here with green burial. Talk a little bit about some of the current practices. And of course, burial and cremation are the two primary forms of disposition. Conventional burial is the burial of the whole body, in all likelihood embalmed, but not not always, and a lot of people don't realize this, but in many locations around the world, embalming is not required, although it is a practice. Typically in wood that is sealed and in metal caskets that are sealed, the thinking being that water and bugs and so on would not get into the casket. So it's part of the sanitization of the whole experience, and really the removal of death from everyday living, unlike even just 100 years ago. And in the last 20 or 30 years, the increased use of reinforced concrete vaults or liners. There are a number of reasons why that has come into play, but those are a couple brief descriptions of the primary facets of conventional burial. And then, of course, cremation, which over the last 50 years has become, at least in most parts of North America, almost 50% of families on average choose cremation. In the western parts of North America, many more than that. As you move east and southeast, burial is still about 50% of people are choosing burial. So it's considered a more environmentally friendly option. We've actually phoned people up and we've asked them why are you choosing cremation? In some of the polls we've done, and people consider cremation more environmentally friendly. It's perceived to be less costly. Crematoria can emit, not always, especially with the more modern equipment available, which scrubs out things like mercury and furans and other byproducts, but crematoria can emit particulates in particular. And of course, they're energy intensive. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the scattering of cremated remains has impacts. Cremated remains are actually toxic to plants. And so that's another reason why some people are questioning cremation, and many people that are coming to green burial are coming from the place of having previously chosen cremation as their selected disposition option. Some of the environmental impacts of these conventional burial methods are the land use challenges associated with traditional cemeteries that bury in perpetuity. So the land is locked up for that one family, one death, one decedent forever, and in perpetuity is a long time. And that is really exacerbating the crisis in cemeteries across the world, not just North America. I know we have some viewers today from Africa and points beyond, and the situation there is as or even more dire than it is in North America. The greenhouse gas emissions are significant, of course, with cremation. For reasons which I would assume to be obvious to you, given the combustion that occurs, and the consumption of fossil fuels is significant with cremation. Approximately the equivalent of 2 SUV gas tanks full of fossil fuel energy is required to cremate a body, and that is significant. There is also significant depletion of woods and other valuable resources. Millions of board feet of wood is put into exotic caskets, oftentimes from places where the ecosystem is endangered. Hardwoods in particular are being harvested and used for the sole purpose of caskets, building caskets. Also a lot of steel and concrete is used with the concrete liners, and both of those are highly energy intensive, a significant carbon footprint. And of course, then there's the use of chemicals. Not always, I must emphasize, embalming with formaldehyde. The creation of formaldehyde is energy intensive. The handling of it has to be done very carefully. And also, when treated woods are used in caskets, these are also toxic materials that are expensive and energy intensive to create. So given that, what is the green burial philosophy? And I must add that um, uh, in our conversations over the last 15 or 20 years around green burial, um, there's been some confusion as to whether there is an edict or whether there are hard and fast rules associated with green burial, and I really wanted to emphasize today that that is not the case. That cemetery operators, managers, and land managers are making informed decisions based on more or less based on these philosophies associated with green burial. And I'll get into some of the pillars of green burial in a moment, but I think it's important for you to learn today that a green burial philosophy is primarily based on the principle of minimizing the environmental impact. I've listed some of those impacts that arise as a result of conventional interment methods. And so green burial, the corollary is minimizing those impacts, minimizing the number of fossil fuels that are used as part of our last act on this earth. Things like cutting of grass, again, in perpetuity. That's going to take a lot of gasoline for a long time. Or if you're maintaining higher grade turf cover, the chemicals associated with that and pesticides. If we can avoid doing that in our green burial areas, we're doing well by the planet. The other principle is returning the body to the earth and in full contact with the earth. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is to minimize the amount of acreage or hectarage needed for interment. And also where the magic of soil microbiology can work to break the body down. And we'll talk a bit later about the reuse of graves, but if the body is in full contact with the soil, the ability to reuse that site after even as little as 15 or 20 years increases. And I think that the green burial movement and the philosophy is all part and parcel of bringing back the experience of death and mourning more fully and more prominently in our society. And we're seeing this more and more with families that are choosing green burial. They want to be engaged. It's a spiritually fulfilling final act because of the involvement of the family, the cemetery operator, the cemetery field staff. It's a much more holistic experience. And what we've also heard is that it's a statement about the personal values of those that have chosen green burial. Many people have worked their entire lives, especially boomers, to change things and to make the world a better place and care for the environment. And so as one of their final acts, green burial is an important statement. So within the context of that philosophy, then, the principles of green burial are founded on these five. I'm adding a sixth pillar. The first, as you might imagine, is no embalming. And sometimes it's difficult to avoid embalming. And we realize that, and we can talk more about that during the question and answer period if you wish. But on the whole, families are discouraged from embalming if they can avoid it. Obviously, if a body has to be transported a long distance, embalming certainly makes things easier. There are methods of keeping a body cool in warmer climates so that family can gather and that the green burial can occur somewhat after the time of death. And those methods do not involve embalming. The other pillar is around the principle of a biodegradable shroud or casket. And of course, what this does, two things this does is it minimizes any significant energy consumption and carbon footprint associated with bringing exotic woods from other parts of the world, or steel caskets or copper caskets and the embodied energy there. But more importantly, it allows the body through, say, a wicker casket or a recycled wood casket to be in contact with the earth. And that has both spiritual as well as biological benefits that I mentioned a moment ago. The other thing that biodegradable shrouds or caskets have that is a benefit is there are no lacquers or toxic volatile materials that are used to preserve or make them shiny. So they are a natural product in that sense. We already had a question this morning about markers, and are the markers the same as in a conventional cemetery? And no, they're not. The thinking here being that rather than bring exotic stones, or granite, it's not exactly exotic, but some of the cheapest granite comes from India or China. And there's, of course, a fossil fuel impact and carbon footprint associated with the transport of that, not to mention questionable extraction practices in some locations. And so the idea here is that memorialization, which we all recognize is an incredibly important part of the mourning process and the grief process, that the marking of the grave occurs on a communal headstone or a communal device of some kind. And of course, with the advent of digital memorialization devices, these things can be in the cloud as well. Epitaphs and memorializations can occur digitally, or on, and I'll show you some pictures of this on local stones found locally and inscribed locally. So again, we're not using energy to transport stones from across the world. The other primary pillar of green burial is ecological restoration or conservation. The thinking here being that the site should be left in a healthier, more productive, biologically productive state than before it was disturbed. So in some of the examples that we'll show, primarily from North America, you'll see for example, on the West Coast, the reestablishment of fir and Gary oak forests. On the prairie provinces and states, the reintroduction of tall native prairie grasses. In some of the northern climates, the introduction and planting of poplar pine species that are, of course, all of these representative of the local ecosystem. And of course, not only is the end result more productive from a habitat and a biological standpoint, ecological services standpoint, but it minimizes the amount of energy that's going to be taken to maintain that piece of geography as part of the sacred burial ground. And last in this list is the principle of efficient land use. And what I'm talking about here is the ability for this land to be used in perpetuity for the burial of other members of the same family, or possibly even strangers, as is occurring in some Canadian municipalities. And so, although for some of the earlier green burial cemeteries in some of the first, frankly, in North America, were built and were were generated from the principle of, well, we want to conserve this land, we don't want it to be developed, and so if we put a cemetery there, it can't be developed, and so the density of graves was really rather sparse. And I think that one of the principles of green burial is that the amount of land that should be consumed for the burial of our dead should be as efficient as possible. And there's lots of different ways that can occur, and we'll show you those some of those examples here. This is an important picture to show. I think it represents a wicker casket, locally made, close to the cemetery. The man standing before this group of cemeterians is Stephen Olson, who is one of the founders of the Green Burial movement in Canada, a name and a figure that should be recognized. And it also shows, for those of you who are in the cemetery business, yeah, we're using a commonly used burial lowering device. All workplace health and safety, occupational health and safety practices that you would find in a traditional cemetery are also necessary for any green burial. We'll talk more about operations issues a bit later. Again, you'll see shoring device, a mechanism to be able to bury close to a recently dug grave. Means that the ground nearby and adjacent can be unstable. And the last thing you want is for, when you open a grave, for the adjacent casket to be exposed or even slide in. So one of the questions that arose is whether soil conditions for green burial is any different than for a conventional cemetery. And the answer is no. You still want to be able to ideally choose ground that can hold a nice, steep, safe side, but you still want to be able to utilize the standard operating procedures you have in your cemetery. In this case, they use shoring for their conventional burials. So shoring is used here as well. Another example of a wicker casket, and in the upper right, the use of leaf mold to mulch the grave. A little bit, the grave is, of course, when you fill in a grave, there's usually surplus soil, though that soil is not carried away in a green burial area. That soil is mounted higher, and then as the casket or the decedent deteriorates, of course, there's subsistence and subsidence, I should say, and so the mulching helps to cover the grave and fill in. So with this in mind, why would you be considering green burial? Why would green burial be, for those of you that are joining us today, from a personal interest standpoint, and those of you that are cemeterians and land managers or land planners? There's, I think, under the conventional heading of sustainability, social, environmental, and economic, socially, families want to be engaged in places of memory, community connection, and personal meaning. This is happening across the whole bereavement sector. The funeral services and funeral directors are undergoing a sea change in their industry, with families expecting more and more involvement right from the moment of death all the way through to ultimately burial. So we're seeing death doulas, we're seeing undertakers who perform one of the most important crucial services in our society, much more involved than they were even 10 or 15 years ago. Environmentally, obviously, the reduced energy and resource needs, these are all really good reasons to try to incorporate green burial into your cemetery or into one of your last choices. And from an economic standpoint, there's relatively low startup costs associated with creating a green burial area. The land use is efficient, or at least it should be. And the interesting thing is, and we've learned this at Royal Oak Burial Park, which has buried more people in their green burial areas. I think they're on to their 4th green burial area now in the last 15 years. That green burial can be as or more profitable than conventional burial. Green burial families on the whole are willing to pay for the very experiences that I've been describing today. I think those cemeteries and those funeral directors that are creative and willing to provide families what they want and what they need are certainly able to do very well. The other aspect of the economics is that although there are establishment costs with a green burial area, the long-term maintenance of the site is going to be less over the years to come. This is crucial because many cemeteries are suffering under the weight of maintaining graves of people who were buried decades ago. And yet, because of our restrictions around the reuse of graves, they have to continue to cut that grass a couple times a week, all spring, summer, and fall, and in some parts of the world, 4 seasons, forever. And that's a big cost. It's a big labor cost. It's a big energy cost. And so I wanted to emphasize that there are upfront establishment costs associated with green burial, like the establishment of any native plants. It takes some care and feeding for the first number of years, but after that, the maintenance costs and resources required will decline considerably. So we're going to take a quick moment here to talk about any of the questions that you have. So Rebecca, what have we heard so far?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I think this is a good follow-up question. It's about public perception of including a green burial section in a existing cemetery. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, it is a good question. And the public perception is, I think the word to describe it is curious. There's been, in my experience, and our firm's experience across North America is that there's no pushback. Unlike in some other aspects of our urban environment where we try to increase native plants and people think it's too messy or not manicured enough, we've never had that kind of pushback. And of course, the moment you see deer and birds and more habitat in a sacred burial garden, I think that the perception is generally positive.
Yeah, this follow-up question here. You spoke a little bit about sort of raising the profile of green burial. So this question is just around how sort of you would sort of otherwise encourage individuals who would be considering cremation or not entering the cemetery at all, if this is a more viable option for those people.
So if I understand the question correctly, it's how do we break through that barrier?
Yes. Yeah.
And one of the things that folks at Royal Oak Burial Park in Victoria, BC will tell you is that when you put green together with burial, the press somehow loves it, and the amount of free advertising, to be crass, that arises is phenomenal. And that's been, I think, one of the best kind of barrier breakers that I've seen is people hearing about it, reading about it in the press, and then families talking about it. The movement is small. I must hasten to say, as a percentage of burials that occur across North America, green burial is still a fraction of of a percent of the total burials that do occur. So it's as you might imagine, in my view, a trend that is here to stay. It's certainly not a fad. The last 15 years have shown us that. The inquiries we get every week show us that. It will continue to increase. But I think the participant is asking a good question, and one that frankly we as advocates in this area have yet to fully resolve.
So you've spoken a little bit about the environmental planning considerations. There's just a couple of participants that have a bit more specific questions. Specifically, is a larger plot needed for green burial? Or do you need to separate the plots further apart than you would for a conventional burial?
Yeah, great questions. And I'm going to be showing some plan images of some cemeteries that will illustrate the point probably better than I can say. Short answer is no, the burial plot does not need to be, and I would even say shouldn't be larger for the efficiency, the land use consumption standpoint. The soil types, whenever you're choosing a cemetery, are what govern the size of the plot. So in many locales we work in where the soil is very soft and gravelly or sandy, of course the top of the grave widens open because of the natural angle of repose of the soil. That means the width of the grave and the length of the grave have to be larger. But that's no different than with conventional burial.
Okay, maybe you'll have one more question before we move on. So a participant would like to know what happens if we can't meet all 5 principles of green burial in their purest form at the cemetery. Can we still have some type of hybrid burial service?
Well, that's a wonderful segue into the second part of our webinar. The short answer is yes. And I wanted to go back to my point earlier that there is no hard and fast edict around these things. There's no laws that dictate these things. The Green Burial Society of Canada, Green Burial Council in the United States have criteria that need to be met for certification purposes. But some of the greenest cemeteries I know have not been certified. We like them to be eventually, but they're more hybrids for those very reasons that the participant asked, Rebecca.
Okay. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you. So, how do we incorporate green burial? The hybrid model, the one that I think is fair to say is by far the most prevalent, at least in North America. And I'm mentioning North America because we've done a lot of work in Africa as well, and I know that there's participants on the line today from Africa, and you know I failed to mention that really the traditional burial methods there in at least sub-Saharan Africa are very similar to the Native American First Nations burials. So a brief aside, I just want to recognize that. But hybrid models involve the combined conventional cemetery with a green burial area. So this is incredibly important because, as I said, most burials that are occurring are still conventional burials. And we want to be able to offer green burials, but at the same time for families that want a conventional burial or want cremated remains interment options, they want to be buried with their people, with their clan, in a cemetery, an existing cemetery. That's why the hybrid model is important. Is typically in an edge part of an existing cemetery, although some of the new cemeteries that are being designed, green burial is actually a centerpiece. And there's fewer setup costs and barriers associated with incorporating green burial into an existing cemetery. The time and money it takes to find land, get it approved, designed, and open can be significant in almost every jurisdiction. And so if you can incorporate a green burial area into an existing cemetery as part of a hybrid, there are many advantages associated with that. This one actually on the slide is a very good one, Heritage Gardens in Surrey, whereas you can see the green burial area is right up against, in this case, a riparian zone set aside for purposes of protecting a creek nearby. This example at Royal Oak was their first foray into green burial, and it was actually a little bit of a gully where spoils from surplus material from other graves had been deposited over the years. So operators knew that the integrity and the depth of the material that was there would be good for burial purposes, but it was surrounded by forest. And so this plan and many others like it are predicated on the principle of painting your way out of the corner, so to speak. So the very first burials were in the furthest distance from the main access road, and the white line that shows the pathway, eventually those will be filled in with graves. So this is what the grave layout looks like. So for those asking about density of graves and size of graves, these are the very same size graves as in the adjacent conventional area. In the lighter, the white areas are the first ones to be used, and each one of these has its own unique section number, of course. The darker green are roughly where the pathways are, and so eventually this entire little acreage here will. In fact, I think it's pretty well full. There may be some reserved graves still to be open, but it's not only full, but it's a wonderfully maturing young coastal forest. Another example here, I mentioned the Tallgrass Prairie, a conventional cemetery. As you can see, the master plan at Rose Hill, Epperkey in Edmonton, and in the upper right is an area near again, near some set aside environmentally sensitive lands. And so it's a really good way of using lands that are maybe not as suitable for conventional area. But it's also, what I really like about this solution is that for families that choose cremation or traditional burial, they can be nearby those in their family that now or in the future may want green burial. And so this is an important aspect of cemetery planning, is that the options not be segregated across significant distances in a cemetery, but that options are relatively close together. Prairie Sky Cemetery in Calgary, Alberta will be open in a year or so's time, and the green burial area there is, as you can see from the plan view, a central part of a main access road into the cemetery. And the first phase, the sort of the half ovals that are shown here, will eventually be able to spread out across the pathways into the adjacent lands, and this whole area will be green burial. We're showing a ceremonial area as part of this, and again, when we talk about the social aspect of green burial, it's important to create places where families can come and gather, not only for the burial itself, but on anniversaries, significant times of the year for a family, whether it's the anniversary date of the death or the burial itself, maybe for the creation of the marker, the communal memorialization. There's lots of reasons why a central accessible ceremonial area is important in these in green as part of the green burial layout. One of the other models that we refer to is a conservation model. And this, as I referenced earlier, was really where green burial got started in Ramsey's Creek in North Carolina, coming on to, 21 years ago now, where the intention there was to protect land from development. And so the density of the graves across and in and amongst the trees in the forest was somewhat less than we might see in other areas. But whether it's the Green Burial Society of Canada or the Green Burial Council, conservation model would meet the criteria for natural burial grounds and the hybrid model. But in general, it's considered the greenest because there are no, in a full conservation model, there are no traditional or conventional burial grounds. And in some cases, cremated remains are not even allowed to be interred. It's typically part of a large area land conservation, although not always. The example shown here is from Denman Island in one of the Northern Gulf Islands in British Columbia that was part of a land conservancy, actually, and it took them a number of years to work out the mechanics of how they would work with the land conservancy. But we see this as a huge potential across Canada, especially in Ontario, for example, where the conservation authorities there have under their control an awful lot of land, some of which is not necessarily needed for conservation and ecological protection purposes, upland and bench areas that we think would be ideally suited. In fact, that there are a number of these candidate sites coming forward now as part of the natural burial movement in Ontario, Canada. Important to show examples from Ramsey's Creek for the reasons that I've mentioned. I think the use of the native stone nearby, obviously sandblasted. Somebody's doing some planning. Shelley, presumably related to the person buried next door, intends to be buried here. In this example, and another I'll show you in a moment, that the grave sites were chosen very carefully with respect to the health and species of trees nearby, avoiding damaging tree roots, clearing and thinning for silvicultural purposes to make the forest as healthy as possible. So although the density is less, the manner and method they used to locate those graves was very sensitively done. And you can see here in the picture on the left, there is some mowing going on, so it's not like mowing is forbidden. But as the forest is regenerating here with younger trees up against the more mature forest, this is how we would see the forest cover, or the shrub layer, as we call it, evolving over time in this sort of model. This is a watercolor that we did as part of to demonstrate to the board at Royal Oak how the landscape would evolve over time. So we've got the before, during, and after shot, and as you might imagine, as the years go by, this becomes a very park-like, biologically productive area. Just wanted to take a minute and talk about some of the operations and maintenance issues. I know that some of the questions that have come in already have been along these lines, but I wanted to say that one of the most gratifying parts of this, in my experience, has been how involved the families want to be. And of course, that comes with, at times, some organizational challenges with particularly field staff. At least in the early going. And I know that at Royal Oak Burial Park in Victoria, which, I hate to going back to it, but it is, I think, one of the best examples in North America. The field staff, that's one of the highlights of their week when they have a green burial family. The family is very appreciative, they're engaged, they understand that they're dialed right in, and staff appreciate that experience as part of their work. So be ready for that. You also need to be ready to look at not only your bylaws, but some of your standard operating procedures. In all likelihood, your workplace health and safety requirements will not allow the family to dig the grave, although some operators have found a way to make that work. But backfilling a grave, families being allowed to throw at least some shovelfuls, if not backfill the entire grave, close the entire grave. Eminently reasonable, assuming that the site is safe, of course, and there's no sloughing and all those other things that as responsible managers you would ensure take place. But that's from a standard operating procedures standpoint. You need to be ready for that, and your bylaw needs to change. Your bylaws, your ordinances, and other covenants that you may have, different state requirements and city requirements, will mean that your bylaws need to be amended to allow for green burial. In some cases, cemeteries that now mandate concrete liners, for example, or concrete vaults, that would have to change. Some cemeteries, not many, but some do mandate or do not allow a shroud, which in this multicultural world of ours does not make any sense to me personally, and should just change by a manner of practice anyhow, regardless of whether you're doing green burial. So some of those things need to be addressed as you update your bylaw, which you're probably doing on a regular basis, or you should be anyway. You need to think about some of the economic impacts, and I touched on some of those already. Ensure that there are sufficient resources set aside, both human and financial resources, to establish these areas, because you can't just walk away from them, or invasive species and weeds will take over. You need to ensure, along with all your other practices, that state, provincial, and local laws are adhered to. Green burial is no different than conventional burial in that sense. All the records keeping, all the records management, all the health and safety issues, the layout, and critically the unique geographic location of every grave has to be done, just like in a conventional burial. I'll show you a unique way of doing that in a moment. So all of those standard requirements will still have to be met. And I'll say that the funeral sector and suppliers are catching on. We spoke to a funeral director in Prairie Provinces yesterday, and he's having difficulty finding a supplier that is green certified. But there are suppliers out there for shrouds, for caskets, for even green embalming fluid. And more and more, we're seeing less pushback from the funeral sector and more embracing of the funeral sector. So, if you're new to this area and or this type of interment, one of the first stops I would make is with your local funeral director and make sure they're on board, because, as I said, they are the first responder when it comes to picking up a body at the hospital or in a home, and they will be helping families make these critical decisions. This is a GPS location transmitter that gets buried in every grave in Fernwood. I'm seeing this in other cemeteries as well, so that you can, with the right app and the right transponder, you can find the location of a grave even in the absence of a marker. So as I said before, it's imperative that every grave have its own unique geographic usually alphanumeric, row 6, grave A, or, plot name, row name, grave number. That's not only a best practice, but usually the law. The idea of using GPS, geographic positioning systems, and using a device like this will, in my opinion, become more and more the norm. well, we know it already is using GPS in the way graves are laid out, and graves found, especially in snow country, where you have to find graves inside of under 2 or 3 feet of snow in the winter. So here's an example again from Fernwood, where they used local stones to mark the graves. They did an extensive biological inventory of the soils, the tree canopy, the shrub layers, and then they created grave plots for based on those criteria. And then underneath each of these stones is one of those purple grapefruit-sized balls that is the GPS. But even in the absence of that transmitter, that location will have its own GPS location shown on a map and through more conventional recording mechanisms. So as we near the end here, just a few minutes on the future of green burial, and brownfield sites are for those not aware, are those sites that have been used oftentimes for industrial purposes before, and across North America. And for example, and other places in the world, cemetery is referring to in Africa. The cemetery, one of them we've worked on there was a sawmill site, classic brownfield site. We're going to see more and more of this as land available for all aspects of urban growth is gobbled up for other purposes. So more creative looks at how cemeteries are located and where they're located will come. I fully expect that grave reuse will come to the fore more so in the next 10 years than it has already. North America is the anomaly around the world where we bury in perpetuity, one grave forever. Most places elsewhere in the world, it is not, the plot term is not forever. So the idea of grave reuse is using the same grave over, usually by a family, generation by generation. Of course, given the mechanics and the biology I've just described, that works well, because the body is pretty much gone inside of 15 or 20 years. The idea of fixed term plot leases, I think we're going to see more and more of that. We're already seeing practices like that in certain parts of North America, where a family signs on right from the beginning. There's no change that occurs after the fact, but where a grave is, you lease it for 20, 30, 40 years. Then there are all those other innovations in decomposition. Promessa, which is a freeze drying method, has been near market for many years now. Alkaline hydrolysis has been approved and is in use in a couple dozen locations across North America. Decompose out of Seattle is an approved but not yet fully in market option. We're going to see more and more of those, and frankly, the environmental footprint of some of those mechanisms is still yet to be measured and determined. But I wanted to flag those for you because they oftentimes arise in this discussion. So further resources, and this recording will be available to you. So if you can't scroll these down right away, Green Burial Society and Green Burial Council are two of the best, and others that will be listed if you'd like a copy of the recording. So I think, Rebecca, we've got 5 or 10 minutes here for next set of questions.
Yeah, we've got a lot of great questions coming in, so thank you for those. So this, I think, is a good follow-up. You were talking a little bit about perpetual care. This participant is wondering, in a green burial area, what, if any, perpetual care is provided? And they say, I assume that decomposition occurs faster. So are there subsistence issues with that?
Yeah, decomposition will occur faster if there isn't a steel casket, of course. And there will be subsistence issues, and that's why having a mulch system, just like the cemeteries used to, topping up the grave, and after a couple of years, and probably again after 10 years. The question of first part of the question. Remind me again.
Um, it's just if any perpetual care is
Oh,
proposed.
perpetual care. Yes, that's a good question, and it falls in nicely with the statement I made that all green burial areas have to meet the current standard for perpetual care as usual, as per the state and provincial laws.
Well, this is a great follow-up because this is about legislation. So this participant is asking, have legislation changes been required for health and wellness reasons in Canada? And are there any causes of death that would prevent this burial option, for example, pandemic or disease?
There have not been any state or provincial statutory requirements. And in most locales, the cemetery is beholden to a provincial or a state act, a bereavement or a cemetery act. None of those have had to change to accommodate green burial. Or very few of them, maybe a couple in the States, because some states require, for example, a concrete vault, but relatively minor and easily done. So there shouldn't really be any issues there. With respect to contamination, there is no more contamination associated with green burial than there is with any other type of conventional burial, either for groundwater or soil contamination, or for bacterial contamination. Cemeteries are actually very safe places to be, the current pandemic notwithstanding, but there are protocols, but those are mostly associated with contact with the families of the decedent, not the body itself.
Well, that's great. That was the next question, so covered off that one. There's been a few questions about record keeping. So you mentioned the GPS tracker. This participant is wondering, do any special records need to be kept other than what is recorded for conventional burial? And how are the locations of the graves tracked?
The short answer is no more stringent than conventional burial. But green burial does, I think, offer the opportunity to modernize the records management system using geographic positioning system technologies.
There's been a lot of questions about markers. I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more to sort of what a typical communal memorial would look like.
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, the slide that we have up now is, believe it or not, it's not populated just yet, but you may see there's a bunch of holes in this piece of steel, and the idea is that this would be a communal memorialization device where plaques can be bolted onto the steel. Oftentimes they are large pieces of stone where every couple months, those have been buried recently, the names are inscribed, sandblasted right into them. This is one area where it's really all over the map. Some places have communal markers, some places have river rocks, as I was showing. Oftentimes, a large piece of granite is used, and a sandblaster comes in every so often and inscribes the names. So yeah, actually for us it's one of the more creative aspects of cemetery design is creating innovative memorialization devices.
We're getting pretty close to 11 a.m. here, so maybe I will end it off with one last question. So this participant would like to know what sort of unexpected issues or concerns, if any, have occurred when green burial areas have been incorporated into existing cemeteries.
Yeah, very, very little that I can think of, aside from curiosity. As I said before, people are sometimes anxious that the area does not look as manicured as other parts of the cemetery. sometimes when families are, green burial families will linger at a site much longer. And so regular visitors to the family plot may wonder what's going on over there. There seems to always be people over in that area. But nothing of real negativity or significance in that way.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that.
Thank you once again, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with any one of us.
Thanks, everyone.